Hi guys, so this could be slightly embarrassing for Sophia, but I'm going to use a quick talk through of her December exam. Firstly, because it was really, really good, and it's written in a really nice, clear style that I think lots of you will benefit from trying to replicate. What I want to do in this video is just talk you through Sophia's writing, but also to just pinpoint the things that she's doing well and also some of the things that she can improve. Because as good as it wasn't quite perfect, and that's what we should all be shooting for. So I want to just remind you the question. The writer's language choice is developing the representation of Lady Macbeth. Now, the really good responses specified within this big category, language choices. Smaller, specific things. Now, her body paragraphs are about Shakespeare's figurative language that portrays Lady Macbeth as cunning, domineering, and confident. And then her second paragraph was about the personification that shows us Lady Macbeth's, what is that word? Not quite got it on the opposite kind of qualities in her personality, which is weak and doubtful. So what I'm going to do is just talk you through the introduction and the first body paragraph and her conclusion, and show you how to execute certain things through the things she's done well and things that she can improve. Now, the intro is the bit of this that I think she and lots of you actually have lots of scope to improve. And it's actually, once you've got your head around this, it's quite straightforward. Now, that GST structure, the general specific thesis that we've looked at before, I would start the general part with what Shakespeare does in the whole play, and then what the scene in question is about. So in this case, you could say Shakespeare, in the Act 1, Scene 5, Shakespeare writes about the tension between the human and the supernatural in Macbeth, and then move on to this scene. In Act 1, Scene 5, we see Lady Macbeth doubting Macbeth's human personality traits, and then calling on the supernatural, the evil supernatural, in order to gain the strength to carry out the plan of killing the king. That's what we mean by general, broad, a gradually less broad focus on the things that matter. So you start with the whole play and then the scene, and then you get even more specific with the ideas that you're going to write about in your body paragraphs. And Sophia does this. At the beginning of this extract, she appears to be domineering towards Macbeth and criticises Macbeth's innocence. Now, the only thing I would say here, you could reframe that sentence so that it's focused on what Shakespeare is doing. It's focused on the writer. At the beginning of this extract, Shakespeare uses, as you do in the topic sentences, uses figurative language to portray Lady Macbeth as domineering. Then the second body paragraph, these are the specific parts. Then she starts to lose her confidence and asks the spirits to take her soul and fill her with darkness. So again, if you were looking at how to improve that, you focus the sentence on Shakespeare. Shakespeare uses personification in order to show us the way that Lady Macbeth loses her confidence and asks the spirits to take her soul and fill it with darkness. Now, she writes a really good subordinate and conjunction sentence here. Even if Lady Macbeth seems to be imitating the witch's action, she is later described as weak and unable to achieve her goal, which is really focused on her really well and the conflict in her character. But you could do it even better, even more precisely, by focusing on her in this extract and focus it on the writer. So even though Shakespeare presents Lady Macbeth in this extract in a way that seems to have her imitating the witches, we see elements of her weakness here that later are explored as she becomes weak and mentally unable to achieve her goal. That then would put your thesis much more focused on the text, the extract that you've been given. I wanted to just quickly show you the body paragraphs because she executes this one really, really well. And there's particular features of this that I think lots and lots of us would benefit from focusing on. So the topic sentence here, Shakespeare's use of figurative language portrays Lady Macbeth as cunning, domineering, and confident. That has those three ingredients. It's focused on Shakespeare, it's focused on the writer, the technique that's being used, figurative language, and then why it's being used, who, what, and why. Shakespeare's figurative language portrays Lady Macbeth as cunning, domineering, and confident. She uses one of those three-part explanations too in this topic sentence, which is excellent. It gives us the range of her qualities. In the starting lines of this extract, describing Macbeth, Lady Macbeth says, "Glams thou art and Corder, and shalt be what thou art promised." Now this here is one of the things that still requires the most work, and Sophie's done this perfectly. The first example, completely fluently integrated, but it looks as if she's also edited this here to get this right, and that's a really good thing to see, that she's taken some time to look back at what she's done, made sure that she's used the structures that we've worked on in class. In the starting lines of this extract, a phrase that tells us, in the first example, where is the bit of text that you're talking about, in line so-and-so, or at the beginning of the text. She uses a participle phrase, describing Macbeth, so a phrase that starts with a present tense verb, portraying this, or explaining something, or describing something. Lady Macbeth says, and then there, that little part of the sentence, the most important part, the subject is a person, a character, or the writer, or a figure in the play, and then a verb, says, and then the lines that are embedded, "Glams thou art and Corder, and shalt be what thou art promised." That part there is so important. This little section in those three lines, from in the starting lines of this extract down to what thou art promised. This section here is, this section is extremely important because it's the most frequently committed error. Is a passage of text that instead of saying this, typically in lots of your work it would read at the moment, we see this in the quote, "Glams thou art and Corder, and shalt be what thou art promised," and it's just not as good because it's not giving us as much information about the quotation in the front part of the sentence that the quote is actually inserted into. So you get a kind of magic there where you're getting given information in the starting lines of this extract here. That's giving us information. It's also giving us more information here. Describing Macbeth, Lady Macbeth says, and then the quote's integrated. So what we're getting there is one fluent sentence that's actually informative. It's giving us information about the piece of evidence that is inserted within it. Then she moves on to zoom ins. The use of repetitive speech emphasizes how she mirrors the witch's language, which makes her seem as if she was one of them. Technique zoom in. The use of repetitive speech specifies a technique and then gives us a really nice, clear explanation of the implied meaning. That it emphasizes how she mirrors the witch's language, which makes her seem as if she was one of them. Then a second zoom in. The phrase, "shalt be what thou art promised." Here, this is a second zoom in and it's focused on a phrase, so not a technique, it's a phrase zoom in. Shows her certainty about her plan. And then she moves on to a second supporting detail. Later, Lady Macbeth explains, "To catch the nearest way, thou wouldst be great art, not without ambition, but without the illness that should attend it." She forgot the little speech marks to end the quote here. So she, again, embeds this quote really well in this little section. Then she moves on to a technique zoom in again. Here, the use of antithesis. She specifies the antithesis between ambition and then illness, two opposing ideas. The use of antithesis is a warning from Lady Macbeth to Macbeth. She warns him that he should not lose his mind and he will accomplish great things. So there's a good explanation of what is suggested by this. She could probably improve that ever so slightly by combining those into a complex sentence. So something that would be like, the use of antithesis is a warning from Lady Macbeth that suggests he should not lose his mind and he will accomplish great things. So we have a single sentence doing the work of two there. In her last supporting detail is a transition. Furthermore, Lady Macbeth calling her spirits. Again, that same structure. Participle phrase, verb, quote. You could say, furthermore, calling her spirits, Lady Macbeth says, "Pour my spirits in thine ear." But this works perfectly well. It's still got all those same ingredients. "Pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise me with the valour of my tongue, and all that impedes thee from the golden round." So the quote's perfectly embedded again. Here the use of personification illustrates Macbeth's wife as a powerful and evil supernatural being. This is also ironic because Lady Macbeth describes her husband, that should be, as the complete opposite we saw at the beginning, which shows her dominance over Macbeth. So again, the technique zoom in start, and it doesn't have to always be in that order, but she chooses to go with a technique zoom in and then a second detail here. Now, she doesn't zoom in here on a phrase or a word. She just comments on an overall ironic effect to this, which is also fine. A second point about the same quotation. And then she brings us to a concluding sentence. Even though Macbeth seems to be in control, we later realise that Lady Macbeth is truly the one who dominates the situation. It's a really good even though sentence. It's very well focused on the character, but what I would say it could do slightly better is focus more on the language. So even though Shakespeare uses language early in the play to show Macbeth in control of the situation, we realise in this extract and later on that Lady Macbeth is truly the one who dominates the situation through the figurative language that Shakespeare uses. You could then add that final second sentence to conclude the paragraph. It's as if, for that tentative judgment, it seems as if Shakespeare is warning the audience about the extreme power and control that the wife of his protagonist possesses, and the way in which she calls upon the supernatural to gain that power and control. Ultimately, I guess playing on King James I's fears about the power of witches and their potential harm. So this is a near perfect body paragraph. There's not too much that you should change in something like this, and it's really, really impressive the way that she's put this together. The second one is carried out almost exactly as well. There's one detail that could be perhaps zoomed in on a number of other times. That was probably, I guess, a time situation in the exam. I'll show you the whole paragraph here. I'm not going to talk through this one part by part, but I'll leave a little shot of it here just so you can pause the screen and take a look at it if you want to. What I wanted to also show you was the conclusion, because again, it's another part of the writing that I think several of you can work on. In conclusion, at first, Lady Macbeth seems to be certain of her plan and criticises Macbeth for being too morally good. However, we realise that she is not what she seemed to be and is doubtful and uncertain of her plan. In addition, Shakespeare's use of irony and figurative language helped build up Lady Macbeth's character. Now, what I would do here is weave these two together. You've got a good conflict in her character that you're focusing on in this thesis statement. So this is the thesis here, that Lady Macbeth seems certain, but she's not quite what she seems. There's a sort of tension in her character. But you want to try and get that language focus, how Shakespeare presents this, into that same sentence. So it could be through his use of repetitive and figurative language. Shakespeare first presents Lady Macbeth as certain and possessing deep conviction in her plan, where later on the demonic imagery she uses to call upon the witches exposes the way that she's not quite as certain about her role and identity as she seems in the opening. That then would do those two jobs. And then here I've just written warning, that final thing, that text as a warning or text as a piece of advice. It may be that Shakespeare in this extract is warning his audience. It may be in this extract that Shakespeare is guiding his audience to consider. Now, those are the few things that she needs to work on. So if you have a look at her scoring here, I'm sure she won't mind me showing you because it's a really, really good score. 18.5 for understanding and interpretation, 19 for organisation, 18.5 for analysis, 18.5 for language. There's a couple of phrasing errors that could push this up. Understanding and interpretation, I could say the second idea could be framed slightly differently. That Lady Macbeth is not quite weak and doubtful exactly. It's more that she feels she needs to call upon sort of extra support in the form of the darkness and the supernatural. So perhaps that she doesn't possess that inner conviction in her own evil without that extra support. And that's probably what would take the understanding and the analysis up ever so slightly higher. Perhaps also if there weren't a couple of details that needed further analysis, more zoom-ins, that would bring it up to 19 and 20. the organisation is nearly perfect. I think with a really well executed intro and conclusion, I would have scored that at 20. So I just wanted you to see this before you attempt this next one, so that you can see a realistic but very, very good student example. So again, sorry I can't be with you guys, and thanks a lot, Sophia, even though I didn't ask you, for letting us all look at your fantastic exam. Good luck.